Let's talk about grand theories today. I'd like to talk specifically about psychoanalytic theory. Now, psychoanalytic theory is considered a grand theory because it's a theory that is comprehensive in that it describes human development from birth to death. It's enduring in that it's been around for a long time, and it's widely applied in that a lot of people know about psychoanalytic theory. We're going to look at two theorists in this category, Sigmund Freud and Erik Erikson. Let's start with Sigmund Freud, because psychoanalytic theory originated with him. In order to understand psychoanalytic theory, specifically Freud's stages of psychosocial development, I think it's important to understand the cultural landscape of Vienna, Austria, at the time in which Freud practiced and developed his theory. I'd like to share with you a brief synopsis from a book by Eric Kandel. And Eric Kandel won a Nobel Prize for discovering how memory is laid down in our brains. And this is the book that I'm going to read to you from, a brief chapter. It's called In Search of Memory by Eric Kandel. Eric Kandel's family was friends with Freud's family. So there's a great deal of overlap in Eric Kandel's early life experience and Freud's research. So to read to you from page 23 of In Search of Memory by Eric Kandel, Eric is talking about his experience growing up in Vienna, Austria, specifically his experience around sexuality during the Victorian era, when the outward standards for sexuality, in which sex was never discussed publicly, there were strict standards regarding the interaction of men and women publicly. For example, women could not attend a physician's appointment without being escorted by another female. So there was a great discrepancy between the outward expectations of sexual expression and what was going on behind the scenes. And I'd like to give you some insight into that now. To quote Eric Kandel, "My erotic experience came right out of one of Arthur Schnitzler's short stories, where a young middle-class Viennese adolescent is introduced to sex by ein süßes Mädchen, a sweet young maiden, either a servant in the house or a working girl outside of the house. Andrea Lee, writing in the New Yorker, has said that one of the criteria bourgeois families in Austria-Hungary used in selecting girls for housework was that they be suitable to relieve the family's adolescent boys of their virginity, in part to entice them away from any possible attraction to homosexuality. I find it interesting to look back and realize that an encounter that could have become or could have been perceived by others as being exploitative never had that connotation for me. My encounter with Mitzi, an attractive, sensual young woman of about 25, began one afternoon as I was recovering from a cold at the age of 8. She sat down at the edge of my bed and touched my face. When I responded with pleasure, she opened her blouse, exposing her ample bosom, and asked me whether I would like to touch her. I barely grasped what she was talking about, but her attempt at seduction had its effect on me, and I suddenly felt different than I had before. As I began with some guidance to explore her body, she suddenly became uncomfortable and said we had better stop or I would become pregnant. How could I become pregnant? I knew full well that only women have babies. Where can a baby come from in boys? From the belly button, she answered. The doctor puts some powder on it, and the belly button opens up to allow the baby to come out. Part of me knew that this was impossible, but part of me was not certain, even if it seemed improbable. I became slightly anxious at the potential consequences of that event. My worry was, what if my mother thought that I became pregnant? That worry and Mitzi's change of mood ended my first sexual encounter. But Mitzi continued thereafter to speak freely to me about her sexual yearnings and said that she might have realized them with me if I were older. So this is not an uncommon experience of Viennese families in the era in which Sigmund Freud developed his theory. So outwardly, we have a climate of sexual repression. Inwardly, there's a climate of sexual indiscretion. So it's not surprising that when Freud opened his private practice and he opened his doors to the public, it was like popping the cork on a bottle of soda that was ready to explode. People wanted to talk about sex. So Freud developed his theory of development based on what he called psychosexual stages of development. He said that each stage of development has its own potential conflicts between a child and a parent. How the child experiences and resolves the conflicts during the first 3 stages influence his personality and his lifelong patterns of behavior. So the first stage is the oral stage, and this is from ages birth to 1. This is where Freud said the lips, tongue, and gums are the focus of pleasurable sensation in the baby's body, and sucking and feeding are the most stimulating activities. The conclusion that Freud drew is that babies become emotionally attached to the person who provides oral gratification derived from sucking. Freud postulated that if someone was not satisfied, if their needs were not met during the oral stage, they would grow up to be what we call orally fixated. That's someone who constantly is chewing gum, constantly smoking a cigarette, or constantly talking as a way to backfill those oral needs that were not met in early childhood. The second stage Freud put forth is the anal stage, and this is from ages 1 to 3. Freud said the anus is the focus of pleasurable sensation in the baby's body, and toilet training is the most important activity. Freud said pleasures related to control and self-control, initially connected with going to the bathroom, are paramount. The next stage Freud talked about is the phallic stage, and this is from the ages of 3 to 6. Freud called this the phallic stage. It's based on the word phallus, or penis. And Freud said the penis is the most important body part. Pleasure is derived from genital stimulation. Boys are proud of their penises, and girls wonder why they don't have one. Now, as you're listening to this and you're recognizing likely the absurdity of this theory today, remember, again, that in the Victorian era, there was a double standard regarding sexuality. There was frequently something very different that was going on behind the scenes than what could be expressed outwardly. So this created a lot of anxiety and conflict around sexual issues. And this is where we see the basis for this theory again. So let's keep that in context. All right. During the phallic stage, boys could experience what Freud called an Oedipus complex. And this is based on the Greek story of Oedipus, who was the king of Thebes. Oedipus fulfilled a prophecy that said he would kill his father and marry his mother, and he brought disaster on his city and his family. So the Oedipus complex essentially says that little boys want to kill their father and marry their mother. If a girl is experiencing conflict at this stage, Freud called this the Electra complex. And again, this was based on the Greek myth of Electra, where Electra and her brother plotted revenge against their mother and their stepfather for the murder of their father. The psychological concept of the Electra complex is named after Electra because this is where little girls would like to kill their mother and replace her and marry their father. What Freud said is the way that a child successfully resolves this stage is by integrating and identifying with the same-sex parent instead of displacing the same-sex parent. The next stage Freud put forth was not really a stage, but more like an interlude or a break between stages. And this is called latency, between the ages of 6 and 11. This is a time when sexual needs are quiet, according to Freud, and children put their psychic energy into conventional activities like schoolwork and sports. The next stage and the final stage is the genital stage. And according to Freud, this stage started in adolescence and continued on through adulthood. Freud said the genitals are the focus of pleasurable sensations, and the young person seeks sexual stimulation and sexual satisfaction in intimate relationships. This is where an individual develops mature sexual interests that can last through adulthood. So, as a footnote to the brief description on Freud's sexual stages, I'd like to say that at the end of his life, Freud recognized that he did make potentially a mistake in saying that sex is the root of everything, and the desire for sex drives everything we do, or it is the center of all conflicts that we have. He recognized the population that he studied was a limited population, and it was very much impacted by the tenor of the times, so to speak. So, at the end of his life, Freud said this, probably his most profound statement ever. The goal of a healthy life is to love and to work. And Angus and I thank you for joining us today. Next time, let's talk about Erikson's stages of psychosocial development.